Good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to see that I still have a little bit of power over people to force them to show up to places, and welcome to all the people who I didn't force to be here in one shape or another. For all 5 of you that aren't being graded by me, my name is Chad Gibbs. I'm an assistant professor here in Jewish Studies, and I'm the director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies. And I get to introduce our fantastic guest tonight. Before I go into Jake Newsome's introduction, I'm just going to say a few reminders of upcoming events, especially for the people that are joining us online. So upcoming Jewish Studies events include on October 20th at 7 p.m. right here in this room, the Pearlstein-Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture will host a talk by Professor Ellie Rosenblatt of Drew University that's got a very interesting title. It's Creole Israel, Abraham Philip Sampson and the Formation of Caribbean Jewish Rootsmen. The Pearlstein-Lipov Center and the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina will host a conference October 21st to 23rd, also in this building. The 46th Annual Southern Jewish Historical Society Conference, Southern Jews and the Atlantic World. And one last event to add, my last event for the Zucker Goldberg Center for this academic semester, which is October 24th at 6 p.m. We will, in partnership with the Charleston Jewish Film Fest, host the film Berenstain, which is about Jews in partisan resistance during World War II. So, to turn to our speaker tonight, Dr. Jake Newsome is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ+ history, whose work educates global audiences. He earned his PhD in history from the State University of New York at Buffalo in 2016. He's published in academic journals as well as popular outlets such as The Washington Post, and has appeared as a guest on podcasts including Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness. His new book, Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, was just published by Cornell University Press and named by the Lambda Literary Foundation as one of the most anticipated LGBTQIA+ books in the category of nonfiction. And I get to add here, it's also sold out, which is something that does not happen to academic books. So I introduced Jake with a huge amount of jealousy. In addition to serving as a historical advisor for film projects, exhibits, and plays, Dr. Newsome has been invited to speak by the French, UK, and US governments about important lessons that LGBTQ+ history has for us all today. And he now works as a museum professional in Washington, D.C. So without further ado, Dr. Jake Newsome.
Well, thanks for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. I'm going to try not to fall off of this stage while we're talking, because then that will be all that everyone talks about. So I had the honor of guest teaching 2 classes on Holocaust history yesterday here on campus, and I see lots of familiar faces from students in that class, so it's really nice to have some familiar faces to kind of anchor me here today. And welcome to all of you who are new in the bunch. I want to express my gratitude before we jump in to Professor Chad Gibbs and the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies for extending the invitation to speak with all of you this evening. And I also appreciate the Women's and Gender Studies program for co-sponsoring this talk and for making it possible. You know, here in the US, we find ourselves in a national debate about what types of information is appropriate for students to have access to. And many of the books right now across the country that are being debated, banned, removed from curriculum or library shelves have to do with so-called controversial topics like LGBTQ history, gender identity, racism, and even the Holocaust. So I think it's more important now than ever that we have organizations, we have funding, we have spaces, and institutions like the Holocaust Center and the Women's and Gender Studies program that can provide a space for us to be able to come here and talk about these types of topics openly and freely. Now, as a college student, which I'm not going to put a number on how many years ago that was, I took every single Holocaust in Nazi Germany and World War II course that my university offered. And at the end of my course of study, with a certain level of naivete that only a college student could have, I thought that I knew every single thing that there was to know about the Holocaust, just after 4 years, right? But it was in my last semester that I attended a guest lecture on, it was called The Men with the Pink Triangle. Right? These were the referring to the label that the Nazis used for gay male concentration camp inmates. And I found myself after that lecture, on the one hand, very frustrated, right, at my education, I guess, that how in the world did I go through 4 years of courses and never learn about the people that we would today call members of the LGBTQ community. I was also very frustrated at myself, right, because this was a time in my life when I myself was coming out, trying to figure out, what does it mean to be gay? What is gay history? How do we fit into the world? And so I myself had not even thought, like, how do I connect, my two passions of LGBT history and Holocaust history? And eventually, when I did ask professors, why we hadn't learned about queer people in the Holocaust, I was told, well, it's because after the Holocaust, homosexuality remained such a taboo that nobody talked about it, including the gay survivors themselves, that it was just a period of silence, right? And it kind of made sense to me, because how could historians write a history without evidence? So I went to graduate school then and thought, you know what, I'm going to be the very first one to break this silence. I'm going to write about it. And so I went to Germany, went into the archives, expecting to find nothing on this topic. So you can imagine my surprise when, in fact, I ended up finding mountains and mountains of material. Right? We're talking from gay survivors, diary entries and letters, to government official documents, law enforcement records, and even a handful of articles that were published in the mainstream press in Germany. So as my German language skills also improved, I began to realize and see that beginning in the 1970s, that even a handful of researchers had begun to go into the archives, look at this material, and begin publishing some of the very first scholarship and history on the Nazis' persecution of LGBTQ people, which then left me with, if that all started in the 70s, how did I, in the early years of the new millennium, not learn about it? Right? How had this history not been integrated into mainstream Holocaust education? So really that question then became the process that turned into my new book, Pink Triangle Legacies. What had begun as a question about what happened to queer people in Germany between the years of 1933 and 1945, then morphed and changed into a study about how German society purposefully forgot the Nazis' LGBTQ victims and the devastating consequences that had for gay survivors. But at the same time, this also became a history about the perseverance of the LGBTQ community, right, who didn't let the oppression of society stop them from diving into the archives, marching in the streets, and writing their own history while professional historians tried to silence them. So to trace this history, which ended up spanning 90, almost 100 years and 2 different continents, I traced the history of a symbol that was at the heart of it all, which was the pink triangle. So tonight, before I can really talk about the pink triangle's legacies, I need to talk about the pink triangle's origins. By the late 1920s, the small kind of fringe right-wing party called the Nazi Party in Germany had begun to gain considerable power. In 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in the country, and in January of 1933, the party's leader, Adolf Hitler, was appointed chancellor of the nation. Now, this new German government wanted to create a so-called racially pure society, and it labeled several different groups as not belonging to this new German society that they wished to create. So the Nazis saw some groups like Jews, the Roma and Sinti, and even Germans with mental or physical disabilities as posing essentially a deep racial biological threat to the safety and procreation of this new master race that they wanted to create. And because the threat in their mind was biological, these people could not be re-educated and reintegrated back into society. So ultimately, the Nazis' policies for those groups morphed into genocide and mass murder, right? Now, the Nazis saw other groups like political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, and the LGBTQ community as being able to be forced to give up the degenerate acts that they were committing, and then being able to reintegrate back into German society as productive citizens. Now, during the course of their reign, the Nazis were obsessed with understanding and then controlling human sexuality, right? Because this literally was the key to procreating and reproducing this master race. One thing that is really essential to understanding this chapter of history is that the Nazis didn't believe that people were born gay. They believed that it was a lifestyle choice, and therefore their policies focused on trying to get gay people to give up this lifestyle and essentially kick the habit of being gay. So the Nazis' policies against LGBTQ people never, at least on a policy level, evolved into mass murder, but they did seek to completely eradicate all manifestations of queer culture. So that meant everything from queer publications to meeting spaces, art, etc. The Nazis from very early on, even on their campaign trail before they gained official power, made it clear that in the new Germany there was going to be no place for the so-called homosexual lifestyle. And then once they got into power, they made it known that that was the case, even if it meant killing those who wouldn't conform and give up their lifestyle. Now, one of the very first things that the Nazis did upon coming to power was trying to control access to information. Right? They banned all LGBTQ publications, including burning over 20,000 rare books, articles, and artifacts from the Institute for Sexual Sciences in the famous book burnings in Berlin of May of 1933. This was a unique, rare institute in the world that had collected information about LGBTQ culture, history, and health from all across the world. At the same time, the Nazis were shutting down all of the different bars and cafes and political organizations that queer people had established for themselves, first in Berlin because it was the nation's capital, but then in waves across the rest of the country. So the Nazis targeted anyone whose gender or sexuality didn't conform to their really narrow traditional ideals. But the Nazis, out of everyone in the LGBTQ community, the Nazis viewed queer men as the most dangerous, right? And this is because in Germany, as in much of the world at the time, it was men who had access to positions of authority, right? So if a man was degenerate, right, and was gay, he could pose a direct threat to whether it was the military or the economy or national politics. So that's why most of the policies that the Nazis used were focused on queer men. Of course, this doesn't mean that queer women escaped persecution. As we'll see, they were thousands of queer women were arrested under a number of different laws. But it just means that the Nazis weren't looking quite as hard for them as they were for queer men. Now, paragraph 175, which you can see here on the screen, was essentially the Nazis' most valuable tool in their campaign against homosexuality. This was a law in the German criminal code that actually existed since Germany was unified in 1871. So the Nazis didn't invent this law or write the law, but the original wording of the law, the Nazis found too constricting. So in 1935, which was the same months that they were writing the famous Nuremberg race laws, they were also amending paragraph 175. And you can see the text of the new version here, which criminalized all indecency between men. You might be thinking like, how in the world, what does that even mean in a legal sense? And that's exactly the point, right? They use a purposefully vague term like indecency so that judges and prosecutors could interpret that however they wanted, with the sole goal of trying to arrest as many men as possible. Now, one of the most striking things that I found in my research is that it seems that most ordinary Germans agreed with the Nazis' war against LGBTQ people. The historical evidence shows that Germans used their voices to activate the power and the violence of the Nazi regime against queer people in staggering numbers. In fact, in the mid-1930s, there was even a front page article run by a Hamburg newspaper asking Germans to quit turning in so many gay men to the police, that it was overwhelming their police force, and to please give their cops a chance to catch up. And the historical records also show that 1/3 of all paragraph 175 cases that ended in a conviction were the result of civilian denunciations. So these were their neighbors or their boss or their landlords turning them in to the Nazis. In total, the Nazis arrested about 100,000 queer men under paragraph 175, and over half of those were ultimately convicted. We don't have accurate statistics yet on how many queer women in total were arrested. But that's because, again, as I said, they weren't arrested under one single law, right? So scholars are now working on trying to compile the total number of arrests, but we're still working on it. So out of those numbers, between 7,000 and 10,000 so-called repeat offenders were sent to concentration camps, right? And if you have studied this history, you know that when prisoners were sent to concentration camps, the Nazis used a color-coded system, right, where they used a colored triangle badge that they put on the concentration camp uniform that signified why that prisoner was being held in the camp. And for the gay men who were imprisoned in the camps, their badge was the pink triangle. So we know that lesbians and transgender people and gender nonconforming people were also sent to concentration camps. They did not have their own separate category in the same way that queer men had the pink triangle specifically for them, but they were most often labeled with a black triangle, which was the badge designating, in Nazi terms, asocial. So these are social deviants, people that the Nazis labeled as not fitting into the new master race, but didn't like already have their own category. So these were people like sex workers and people with alcoholism, homeless people even, all were labeled with the black triangle. Now, pink triangle prisoners were subjected to harder work details in the camps, and this was because hard work was seen as something that was masculine and manly. And so by subjecting these men to hard work, it was supposedly meant to make them more masculine and then thus more straight. Pink triangle prisoners were also subjected to really invasive, cruel medical experiments that were seeking to find a so-called biological cure for their problem. But despite this kind of official Nazi policy of curing or re-educating gay men and then putting them back into society, over 2/3 of all pink triangle prisoners were killed in the camps. This is a pretty staggering mortality rate. In fact, it's only second behind those groups like Jews and Roma and Sinti that were planned for genocide and mass murder. Now, after the Allies defeated Germany in May of 1945, they were left with the task of caring for the hundreds of thousands of concentration camp survivors. Led by the Americans, the Allies adopted a policy of releasing those prisoners who had been imprisoned based on reasons of their race, their religion, or political and ideological beliefs. But they said that it was unsafe to release common criminals back into the general public. And because gay men had broken a national law that technically predated the Nazis, the Allies treated gay prisoners as common criminals. So any of these pink triangle prisoners who still had any time left on their prison sentence, right, that was given to them by Nazis, the Americans and other allies took them straight from the liberated concentration camps and put them in nearby local prisons where they were forced to serve out the rest of their term. During this time, the Allies were also seeking to purge all Nazi laws out of the German criminal code, but they decided that they would leave it up to the Germans to figure out what to do with paragraph 175. So when communist East and democratic West Germany were created in the spring of 1949, both of these new countries had the specifically Nazi version of paragraph 175 written into their criminal codes. So this left Pierre Ciel, who was a Frenchman who had been thrown in a concentration camp during German occupation, to say very powerfully at the end of the war, liberation only for others. Now, beginning immediately after the creation of West Germany, gay people challenged the legality of paragraph 175 in the court system. They said, of course, that it went against the new democratic constitution to continue using the Nazi version of an already discriminatory law. But the West German courts continuously rebuked any and all claims that fascism lived in the law. In fact, in 1957, the West German Constitutional Court ruled once and for all that the country would keep the Nazi version of paragraph 175. And they didn't just keep it, they really used it with enthusiasm. So if you remember that chart that I showed you a few slides back that showed the annual convictions under paragraph 175, if you extend that to include the first decades of West Germany's existence, this is what it looks like. Right, so in those first 20 years of West Germany's existence, they, again, using the Nazi version of paragraph 175, arrested over 100,000 queer men. This led theologian and historian Hans-Joachim Schoeps to claim as late as 1963 that for homosexuals, the Third Reich hasn't ended yet. Now, debates around the legality of paragraph 175 are not the only place where ordinary Germans discussed and learned about the Nazis' gay victims. This also happened around and through debates about government compensation for the Nazis' victims. So here on the screen, you can see a letter written by a German man named Bruno Bouchard. He had spent 4 years in prison under paragraph 175. He survived, and after the war, he writes, he submits an application to be officially acknowledged and considered a victim of the Nazi regime. But the review board denies his request and states very explicitly in the denial that he was being rejected because he was gay and had been charged under paragraph 175. But Bruno is kind of one of those rare exceptions, at least in the archival record, in that he appeals that decision. In fact, he appeals it and appeals it and appeals it, leaving a really rare paper trail that now we were able to find in the archive. And so this is one of those letters in which he's appealing the decision. And you can see that he's underlined a portion of his letter here to really draw attention to it. So I've translated that for you. He's telling the board that he was a political opponent to the Nazi regime, in which that drew ire from the Nazis. But he says, if that's not enough to convince you, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the Nazis castrated him. Right? They said that the only way that they would let him out of prison and not send him to a concentration camp is if he submitted to so-called voluntary castration. He did undergo that procedure, and that was the only way he was able to survive. So he says that such a brutal intrusion on a healthy human body was only possible in Nazi Germany and should be enough to convince you that I was a victim of fascism. But unfortunately, the review board was not convinced. They not only denied Bruno again, but they sent the police after him. So Bruno, unfortunately, was not alone. LGBTQ folks during this early period after the Holocaust compensated at all, quite simply because German government did not consider them victims, but instead criminals. Now I want to show you a clip of survivor testimony from a gay survivor who went on record in the late 90s, only known as Heinz F. And in this clip, it's about 3.5 minutes long, and there's subtitles for the German. He talks about his experience in Germany after the war. Hit it one more time. Okay.
Wie lange sind Sie in Konzentrationslagern gewesen?
Zusammen. Wir haben mal zusammengerechnet, ich glaube 8,25 Jahre.
Und was haben Sie gemacht, als Sie zurückkamen?
Ja, und wir nach Hause kamen.
Ja.
Ja, da bin ich ins Geschäft, elterliche Geschäfte gegangen, das mein Bruder führte. Mein Vater war ja gestorben.
Haben Sie Ihrem Bruder oder Ihrer Mutter erzählt, was passiert ist in den Lagern?
Ich habe mit meiner Mutter nicht drüber gesprochen. Mit meinem Vater konnte ich darüber sprechen, aber
Warum nicht?
aus Scham. Meine Mutter hat doch nie was gesagt. Das ist alles geduldiges Tragen.
Aus Scham, worüber?
Meine Mutter meinte, die Ausschlafen gespürt. Oder aus überquellendem Mitgefühl vielleicht, um mich auch nicht zu beleidigen oder es mir noch schwerer zu machen. Nicht ein Wort hat die.
Für heute ist es ganz schwer vorzustellen, dass Sie diese schrecklichen Jahre überlebt haben und zurückkamen und
Mit keinem drüber sprechen konnten. Ja, habe nie mit jemandem drüber gesprochen.
hätten Sie gern mit jemandem darüber gesprochen?
Vielleicht mit meinem.
Haben Sie später mit anderen darüber sprechen können?
Nie. Es wollte auch keiner hören, wenn man bloß irgendein Stichwort sagt. Das ist mit dem Kram zufrieden. Schnell mal vorbei und damit ist erledigt.
A really tragic testimony. And I think what makes Heinz's story more heartbreaking is that it's just one of thousands, right? Often LGBTQ folks are called one of the Nazis' so-called forgotten victim groups. But I think what we see here is that no one forgot about them. Right? That many Germans knew what had happened to them, and a lot of them agreed with what the Nazis did to gay people. Germans continued to discriminate against and persecute this community. Some men, like Bruno, who we saw from the slide before, broke their silence and told their story. But officials with state authority and power silenced them and essentially told him to be quiet because you're not a real victim. As we see here, the stifling environment of homophobia forced some men like Heinz to keep his memories hidden, right? Never to speak of them, even to his own family. So writing this book has taught me a lot about the nature of silence. Right? Going in, I thought that silence was a noun, right? The absence of sound or the absence of memory in this case. But what we're seeing here is silence as a verb, right? To silence, to force someone into being quiet. West German politicians and judges and historians and journalists and even members of the public silenced the Nazis' LGBTQ victims for decades. But by the 1970s, gay activists were about to break that silence once and for all. Now, in the summer of 1969, the West German parliament finally amended paragraph 175, getting rid of the Nazi version. And they didn't do this because they were pro-gay rights by any means. In fact, it was because too many people were accusing them of not having learned from their recent Nazi past. This new version, again, which went into effect in 1969, legalized being gay between men over the age of 21. But this was still discriminatory because it was still a higher age of consent than was set for straight people. But either way, this led to paved the way for the emergence of a political gay rights movement. And activists in this new movement sought to mobilize queer people across Germany into political action. Now, during this time, coming out and publicly, visibly claiming a gay identity was seen not just as a personal decision, but also as a political and important pivotal step in ending the societal oppression of the gay and lesbian community more broadly. So West German gay activists suggested that they out themselves by wearing a gay logo, a gay symbol, which of course raised all kinds of questions about what would that be? What is a gay symbol? And how do you market or mark oneself as gay? In 1972, a publisher in Hamburg released a really short book that would come to have monumental impact. It was written under the pseudonym Heinz Hager, and it was the very first book written by a gay concentration camp survivor to tell their story. And the title, The Men with the Pink Triangle, offered a solution to the gay movement's problem of visibility. So activists knew that West Germans would instantly recognize the pink triangle as a concentration camp symbol, and thus be faced with the fact that their recent history was not completely in the past. So in March of 1972, a group in Frankfurt, Germany called Rot Schwul became the very first gay rights organization in the world to use the pink triangle in contemporary activism. The Gay Action Group of West Berlin, or abbreviated HAAW in German, was the nation's largest and most influential of these gay rights groups, and soon thereafter they also adopted the pink triangle as their own logo. Now the HAAW activists knew and stated quite explicitly that their reclaiming of the pink triangle was not just a political tactic. This also represented a fundamental transformation of a symbol and of an identity. So the original pink triangle had labeled being gay as something criminal and worth punishing. But in reclaiming it, these activists said that being gay is in no way shameful. They sought to rob the pink triangle of its negative power by saying that being gay is no longer an insult, and in fact, we wear this symbol as a badge of pride. So during my research, I met this man, Peter Heidenstrom, who was a founding member of that West Berlin group. And he told me that the use of the pink triangle signaled, on the one hand, an individual's choice to come out of the closet, but also essentially represented a coming out of this particular chapter of history, right? They had been closeted for the past 30 years. So the public display of the pink triangle in gay rights activism also signaled a break or a shift in the tactics of gay activism. So through arguments that were based on the right to privacy, previous generations helped establish this concept of the metaphorical closet as a necessary safe space for queer people, essentially to hide from government punishment. But beginning in the 1970s, the pink triangle sought to tear the closet door off its hinges. In wearing the pink triangles on badges and pins, plastering it on park benches and trains and flyers all over West Germany, gay activists asserted that citizens in a democratic society had a fundamental right to express their sexuality freely and openly. Now, the reclamation of the pink triangle originated in West Germany, but it didn't stay there for very long. In August of 1974, the Gay Activists Alliance in New York City were planning a rally in support of a gay rights bill that was up for debate in the city council at the time. So led by activists David Thorstad and John Lauritsen, they designed and wore these pink triangle badges that you see here. Again, this was August of 1974. This became the first documented instance of the pink triangle's use in gay rights activism in the United States. From there, it really spread across the country. So gay activists used the pink triangle and the history that it represented to call out homophobia and to promote legal equality. They did so from New York all the way down to Miami and pretty much everywhere in between all the way to San Francisco. In America too, these activists understood that when they were using the pink triangle, they were transforming something that was negative into something that was powerfully positive. And in an interview, the Jewish and lesbian activist Martha Shelley told me, with her kind of characteristic grit, that the pink triangle also had the added benefit of giving the middle finger to the Nazis. Now, by the mid-1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widespread and widely recognizable symbol of gay rights activism throughout North America and Europe. As you can see from just kind of a small selection of this memorabilia here, it resonated with people from different ethnicities and backgrounds, as well as from various gender identities and sexual orientations. But it was in 1986 when a group of activist artists in New York City they catapulted the pink triangle into the public consciousness in a new way when they designed this now iconic Silence Equals Death poster, which was meant to motivate people to take action during the deadly AIDS crisis. And after the AIDS activist group ACT UP adopted the poster the following year, the pink triangle became a visible symbol of activism all across the world. But the pink triangle was never just about politics. Right? It went much deeper than that. Transgender activist Nancy Dangeroni used symbolism as a means of bridge building. So as she told me, there was a lot of homophobia in the trans community in the 1990s, as well as transphobia in the gay community. So she tried to build solidarity among these two communities by designing this pin, which combined the symbolism, right, of the gay community and the trans community. And it was intersectionality that also promoted and prompted Jose Gutierrez to form Triangulo Rosa, a gay support group for Latina gay men and lesbians in Washington, D.C. And Jose, who you can see here, has become a really dear friend since we met in my research for this book. And he speaks so passionately about how and why the pink triangle resonated with him as a Mexican American who had no direct connection to the symbol's origins in Germany. He felt connected to this symbol because the pink triangle had come to represent a gay community, indeed a gay identity that transcended national borders and had a shared history. That history was also vitally important for Black and queer author Cheryl Head. In the early 1980s, she traveled to Israel for a work assignment. And while there, she visited Yad Vashem, which is Israel's national Holocaust memorial. She recalled standing in shock as she was reading essentially one of those charts that we saw earlier with all the different triangle labels. She said later that when she got back to the US, she saw the pink triangle again, this time on the Silence Equals Death poster, but commented that the poster would not have been as meaningful or as powerful to her if she had not already learned about the history behind the symbol. Unfortunately, that history was still largely unwritten and under attack. Professional historians, museums, and academic journals all refused to study, fund, or provide space for research on this topic. And as late as 1996, you can see a German newspaper clipping here, a state archive in Hamburg got caught destroying case files on the Nazis' gay victims in order to make room for what they called more archive-worthy material. So as I mentioned earlier, since the 1970s, a handful of grassroots scholars have been risking their reputation to research this history. And in the early years, there was really very little difference between researcher and activist. Right? The people who were rummaging around in the archives were the same ones that were marching in the streets as well. To this day, it's still a small group of us who are researching, writing, and preserving this history, and my book would not be possible without the decades of work of the people that you see here on the screen. Now, in 2002, the German government finally recognized the men persecuted under paragraph 175 as official victims of the Nazi regime. This also meant that they were eligible finally for compensation. But at that point, at the time of the 2002 decision, no gay survivors came forward. Right? They would have been at least 80 years old at the time, and for their whole lives, their government had told them that they were not worthy. So we can imagine that probably in 2002, that decision by the government was seen as too little, too late. So to this day, no gay survivor has received a single penny of official compensation from the German government. So up until now, the debates around memorials and compensation have focused on paragraph 175 and the Pink Triangle prisoners, right? Which means that these debates have centered on the experiences of queer men. So that has led to several outcomes. One being queer women were not eligible and still are not eligible for compensation. And second, that it was only this year, April of 2022, that the very first monument to the Nazis' lesbian victims was allowed to be placed at a concentration camp memorial site. So this is still a history that is very much being debated even to this day. And so now we are coming to the conclusion of the talk. Right? If you ask anyone what the symbol of the LGBTQ community is, probably no one would say the pink triangle, right? Everyone would answer the rainbow flag. And as it turns out, the rainbow flag was designed and created pretty specifically to be the antithesis or the opposite of the pink triangle. So in 1978, the gay politician Harvey Milk in San Francisco went to his friend and artist Gilbert Baker and said that he wanted him to design something that had a little more soul for the upcoming gay pride parade. Baker agreed, stating that, yes, quote, "We only have the pink triangle, which comes from the Holocaust and Hitler. We need something more that's more uplifting, something happy for such a festive occasion." So since then, especially starting in the 1990s, the rainbow flag has become the predominant symbol of the LGBTQ community. It's achieved a level of visibility beyond the queer community that the pink triangle never did. But I would argue that in order for it to become so widespread, it has also had to be tamed, right? Made less radical and made more acceptable to mainstream society. So in a lot of ways, the symbol that originated as a gay pride emblem has now been turned into a PR tool or a marketing tactic, right? Each June, corporations turn their logos into rainbows. They make lots of money. They might put, a same-sex couple in their commercials. But someone like myself could then be left wondering, where are those same corporations when state governments began to dismantle LGBTQ rights? Essentially, July comes around and all the rainbows disappear. Despite the cliches, there's not always a rainbow at the end of every storm. LGBTQ folks were among the communities that the Nazis targeted first because they knew that doing so would shore up votes that would help them get the political power that they so desperately wanted. Similarly, today it's not a coincidence that we are seeing the resurgence of white supremacy, extreme nationalism, book burning, and the worst year on record for anti-LGBTQ legislation. Protecting so-called traditional values is used to unify conservatives that might not agree on anything else, which was a tactic used quite similarly in Germany in the 1920s. In today's era of the Republicans don't say gay bills, we need the pink triangle more than ever. If we are to truly honor those who originally wore the pink triangle, whether without a choice in the concentration camps, or even those who decided to wear it and reclaim it first, we together in this room have to commit to action. Right? We have to work on a daily basis to turn our ancestors' wildest dreams into a reality. The LGBTQ community has every right to exist. Right? and not just quietly in the closet, but visibly in films, in TV shows, in history books, in curriculums, right? In every single way that we talk about the world, we have that right to exist and to be seen. But we also have to collectively fight like hell to protect that right, because the pink triangle shows us what happens if we don't. Thank you very much. I would be happy now to answer any questions that you might have.
Let me get to you with the microphone. No, everybody thinks they're loud enough, but you won't be heard online if I don't get you. No.
We have folks who are attending live. I mean, online, sorry.
First of all, I would just like to say that was very, very like informative and engaging, and I thank you for coming to speak to us.
Thank you.
In the modern, excuse the word, zeitgeist, there's a lot of like intersectionality in terms of you're not just a gay man, you're a gay man who is X and Y. Is there I want to say paper trail, is there like evidence of Nazi victims that are crossovers, are the middle of the Venn diagram, that like do those stories get told?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that now we're beginning to see that intersectionality, that intersectional lens is the only way that we can understand the Holocaust, right? The Nazis had, we showed that chart where like everyone could be a political opponent or a homosexual or a Jehovah's Witness or, you know, Roma, as if those categories existed neatly apart from each other, right? But as you pointed out, we don't have just one identity. We're constantly, you know, utilizing, embodying multiple identities at the same time. So an intersectional lens is the only way that we can understand, for example, the students in the class. We looked at some documents yesterday about why this one German man was arrested 3 different times under the law, right? So you might think, well, why wouldn't they just like throw him away after the first offense? But he was German, he was Protestant, he was wealthy, he spoke 3 languages, and he was a World War I vet who fought valiantly for the country, right? So all of this, that intersectionality of being in the master race allowed him a different level of flexibility that someone, let's say like a queer Jew would not have, right? So that also helps us explain why some people seem to be targeted more than others, and how others were able to try to maybe escape persecution. I think also the intersectionality explains why, for example, that there were queer perpetrators as well. I think that's something we also can't ignore, that there were queer people in Germany in the 1930s who were incredibly anti-Semitic, were also racist, and found Nazi ideals promising, right? And tried to join the Nazi party, only to be then purged out of the party later, right? So I think that when we look at that, intersectionality helps us understand not only kind of victimization, but also then the flip side, which was why some people then were drawn to the Nazi party. Thank you for that question.
Y'all are going to keep Professor Gibbs on his toes.
Getting your 10,000 steps.
Yeah.
Professor Newsome, we've seen how McCarthyism, the satanic child abuse hysteria, and even the coronavirus have affected US society. I'm wondering about the tension between paragraph 175 and German Gemütlichkeit. Did people turn cold? Is it fair to say that there might have been a fundamental turn in the German temper as a result of this particular pressure from paragraph 175?
That's really interesting, right? And it gets at the heart of the question of do laws influence people's attitudes and actions, or are they a reflection of those attitudes and actions? And I think it's like, right, the chicken and the egg, right? There's no, it's cyclical. I personally would argue, after looking at the evidence, to say that paragraph 175 was not a moment of shift from German attitudes of cordiality and hospitality, but actually was one of those instances where the German public was in alignment with Nazi ideals, right? If we remember that paragraph 175 existed right before the Nazis and was enforced pretty strictly. Of course, the Nazis just completely transformed it. But I think that just like the Nazis didn't invent anti-Semitism, they didn't invent homophobia. And in fact, the way that they were, the speed with which they were able to really destroy the vibrant queer life that was in, at least in Berlin at the time, kind of hints at this fact that homophobia was always just below the surface and needed an outlet. Yeah.
That's my clear judgment.
They're all good questions. So how would you say that, like, in the book you got into how there's this question of whether or not paragraph 175 was fundamentally a German law or if it was a Nazi law? Could you get more into, like, sort of that, like, what makes a law fundamentally part of that nation and their identity?
So I think, and that's a really good question too, and actually kind of builds on the previous question. All of the debates, especially after the Nazis were defeated and when West Germans were challenging the legality of paragraph 175 in court, that was the basis of the debate, was the 1935 version of the law still a German law, or had the Nazis changed it to the extent that it now was a fundamentally Nazi law? And so, right, there were those who were arguing that it was now a Nazi law were saying that it reflected the racist and homophobic ideas of the Nazis, and the fact that Nazis amended it, felt that they needed to amend it, was evidence enough in itself, right, that this was now a fundamentally new Nazi law. And I'm paraphrasing here, but I don't even have to extrapolate. The West German government explicitly stated that, yes, we admit that the Nazis changed the wording of the law in 1935, but all they were doing was trying to bring the wording into alignment with the spirit of fundamentally German law. They were specifically saying, we agree with the changes that they made, and in fact, they were just making it more efficient. So in 1950s, West Germany is saying, even though the Nazis changed it in 1935, this is a fundamentally German law. Like they were very consciously protecting that law. Yeah.
Using the word Nazis instead of another three-word phrase is frightening to me. White Christian nationalism, which is trying to prevail in the United States at this moment, surely was behind the Nazis' ability to accomplish these evil things that they did. Would you agree?
I would say that certainly at any given point, Nazi leaders relied on and even incorporated not just anti-Semitism, but racism and even Christian nationalism into their speeches, into the way that they tried to fan the flames within the populace. Some of the Nazi leaders themselves really did not care about religion at all, but they knew that their voters cared about it, right? So they knew that in speeches, if they talked about returning Germany to, its rightful place as a as a Christian powerful nation, they knew that was going to resonate with some Germans who felt that they no longer had a place in this new Germany of the 1920s that was more globalized and more secular in some cases, especially in Berlin, who felt that Germany was no longer theirs. right? So there was always this idea, this messaging that we've gone too far astray from what Germany really means, and we need someone with a strong hand to bring it back, to restore it to greatness, right? And part of that was being a good traditional Christian German who was going to get married and have lots of babies for the fatherland, right? And I think that some of those elements can certainly be seen today, right? And I think that we have to be able to look at history and understand how certain rhetoric, certain catchphrases can be used to essentially draw people into a frenzy. And maybe they wouldn't normally think of themselves as, I don't know, racist or violent, but they're hearing time and time again politicians tell them that your life, your way of life is being taken away. And we need to fight to get it back. I think that's we've seen history before demonstrate that's very dangerous.
Okay, so as you said, and as like a lot of us noticed, the pink triangle, like in its use and like symbology, especially, it's like decreased a lot since like the whole AIDS crisis and all of that. But do you think that if that came back as a symbol, or if that became more popular, especially when it comes to talking about gay rights, that would become far less commercialized? Do you think that it would like take it back to its like protest roots, like that whole legacy, and companies would not get in on it as much?
I would hope so.
Right. I think that from the beginning, the pink triangle was meant. Its reclamation was a radical act in itself, right? And the creators of the rainbow flag specifically said they'd want something less radical. And I'm not trying to bash on the rainbow flag. Like, I have one outside my house. Maybe they can like coexist with each other. But I think when we're seeing this rising tide of everything we just talked about, right? Nationalism and homophobia, it's not enough to just be like proud and say we're here. Like, we do need a more radical rallying cry to show that, people, the queer folks in Germany in 1925, who had the most vibrant LGBT scene that the world had ever seen up to that point, probably dismissed the rise of the Nazi Party as just like some fringe group. We have these rights, we're not going back. But history shows us exactly what can happen if you don't try to fight right for those rights. Progress is incredibly fragile. Yeah.
I'm going to take advantage of having the microphone and ask my own questions. I think you and I would agree that everyone who is in Holocaust studies hopes that one of the things that teaching about the Holocaust does is make it socially unacceptable to be an anti-Semite. And I wonder if you could comment on whether or not you feel like the first uses of the pink triangle as a symbol for queer people was attempting to do the same thing, to make it unacceptable to be a homophobe in public because of its connections to Nazism.
Yeah, and I would say that I think
That worked, I would say, more so in Germany, West Germany, than it at the beginning, because it was still like that was still a very recent chapter of their history. And so part of, yes, you're right, of saying that we have the right to be visible is also saying that society does not have the right to be homophobic, because look what the Nazis did and look where it led. I think that once it jumped the Atlantic and got to the United States, which is still true to this day, calling someone a Nazi is kind of just a political baseball bat, right? That anyone you don't agree with, they must be Nazis. Oh, they must be fascists. And really the left and the right both does that. I mean, as a historian, I think that if you look at the history, one side of that debate does more fascist-like things than the other. But I think that could also be one risk of always calling on this particular chapter of history, is that then people get jaded by it, right? And then they just say, oh no, you're just being too high, it's hyperbole, when actually what we're seeing today is, it's just the echoes are very scary.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could just speak to the East German experience, because it sounds like things were quite bad in West Germany, but I wonder if things were good, bad, differently bad, something like that in East Germany as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's so my book does focus on West Germany. I will say before I answer the question, if you are interested in the East German case, there's a really great book that just came out by a historian named Sam Huneke, and it's called States of Liberation, and it looks at it compares and contrasts East and West Germany. It's really, really good, so I recommend that. Part of East Germany's identity was that they were a communist Soviet country. So part of being communist is like inherently being anti-fascist. So for East Germany, it was completely incompatible for their national identity and their country to have a law that had been amended by the fascists. So even though the Allied powers kind of wrote paragraph 175, the Nazi version, into their law, into their criminal code, within a matter of months, East Germany gets rid of it. Right? They convert it back to the original 1871 version, which is a lot more lenient, and so therefore we don't have a lot of reliable statistics, but the numbers of men arrested in East Germany were maybe 5,000 compared to 100,000 in West Germany. And again, this was not necessarily because East Germany was so pro-gay rights, but it was that they couldn't stomach using a fascist law as part of their national identity.
Well, that brings us to about 8 o'clock. If there's not a last minute question, I'll say thank you so much for your talk and ask everyone else to thank Newsome.